There's a famous picture of 3 Israeli soldiers after the 1967 war walking into the old city, and most people can immediately recognize one of them, and people who know something about Israel can almost definitely recognize the other one. The one that's easy is the guy that has the eye patch, Moshe Dayan. Another one that's easy is the guy who was the head of the army who later became prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin. And then there's the third guy, and his name is the other guy. Nobody knows who that guy is. Now, every Israeli knows who he is, but if you see, there's Yitzhak Rabin, there's Moshe Dayan, and then there's that famous other guy. It's like the fifth Beatle. You don't know who he is. The truth is, his name was Uzi Narkis. He was the head of the paratroopers that conquered the old city in 1967, 55 years ago this week. Shavuot reminds me of that other guy. It's a big holiday. It starts tomorrow night. But there are 3 pilgrimage holidays: Sukkot, Pesach, and the other guy, Shavuot. You know what Pesach is. You most likely know about Sukkot, right? You've seen the sukkahs. Maybe you built one when you were younger. Maybe you still build one today. I do. You should. But Shavuot is like, what is that one? Do we really do that one? What is it? So the answer is yes, we still do it. Right? We've been doing it for 3,300 years. We're still into it. But we're not quite sure what it is. But if you say, well, what do we know about it? One thing you might know is we read the book of Babe Ruth. It's a baseball holiday. No, we read the book of Ruth. You've heard of that? We read the book of Ruth? But here's a better question. This one you might not know the answer. Why? What does Ruth have to do with Shavuot? And why are we going to read it this weekend? A better question is, why is the book of Ruth even in the Tanakh? Why is it even in the Hebrew Bible? It's 4 short chapters, somewhere towards the end, on page like 1800 and something. You probably don't spend a lot of time learning it. And it's really just a little story. And to a certain extent, it's not even that great of a story. It's short. It's just 4 chapters. It's got 2 really powerful highlights. Ruth says to her mother-in-law, "Your God will be my God," which means that Ruth converted because she was a Moabite. And she chose Torah. And so that's the reason why we read Ruth on Shavuot. Because Shavuot is the anniversary of the Jewish people choosing Torah. And that, to me, is not that exciting. Nor is it the real reason why we read Ruth on Shavuot. I think the connection to Ruth is much deeper than she just converted. A lot of people mistakenly say, well, this is a great story because it's about the first convert to Judaism. Well, Moses' wife converted. Moses' father-in-law converted. Abraham and Sarah converted. Centuries and centuries and centuries before Ruth was ever born. So she was not the first convert. Shavuot and Sinai isn't about really choosing Torah. It's more about accepting reality. For the Jews to accept the Torah, that's like a fish accepting water. You have no choice. You need it. You can't live without it. It's part of who you are. God came to the other nations and said, "Do you accept the Torah?" They said, "What do you mean?" So God said, "Do you accept my commandments?" And what did the other nations say? "What's a commandment?" And God said, "Forget it. So God came to the Jews. And he said, do you accept the Torah? And the Jews said, your Torah? We're in. And then they said, what's a commandment? That's the difference. We knew that if it came from God, then it was a part of what we were supposed to be in. We'll figure out what the mitzvahs are later. We're still trying to figure them out. But we'll figure them out at some point. So the story of Ruth has to be something more than she just converted. And the Midrash adds a lot of color commentary to the opening story. If you've ever read the book of Ruth, and you should, it'll take you about 6 minutes to read the whole book. It's real short. But if you ever read it, it starts out very succinct. By the way, if you read it without the Midrash, you'll learn almost nothing. But if you read it with the Midrash, you get the full story. And the full story goes like this. Ruth opens, and there's a famine in the land. I mean, it sounds like almost every book in the Bible, but there was a famine in the land. And there was a man named Elimelech. Elimelech was a philanthropist. Elimelech was the kind of guy you walk around like the museums of Moab had his name on them. You know, he was one of those kinds of guys. He had so much money that if there was a famine, he had enough food saved up that he could support the whole community for 10 years. Well, now a famine came, and now no one had food. And what everyone did was they sent their servants or their handmaidens or their kids out to try to collect food, to beg for food, to see who had food. And Elimelech, right away, the next thing that happens in the story of Ruth is that he dies. And so a good question would be, what happened to him? Because we don't know. The story in the Bible doesn't tell you. But the Midrash tells us that he sent out his maidservants as well to go and look for food. And when everyone else saw, he didn't need the food. He was just storing up his own without giving it out. And he felt, well, if it's time to look for food, I'll look for food too. And when everyone else saw that he was looking for food too, all of the Jewish community, they lost hope. They said, he's our security blanket. If he's out looking for food too, we're all in serious trouble. And his punishment was that he died. And soon later, his two sons, whose names were Chilion and Machalon, they both died. Now, were those really their names? Machala, I don't know what you all named your kids necessarily or why, but he named his kids Machalon and Chilion. Chilion means destruction, and Machalon means disease. It's like a cheery bris. Ladies and gentlemen, disease. Ben Elimelech. Have a bagel. Right? I mean, what kind of bris is this? So the Torah is really telling us, or the Tanakh is really telling us, that these guys are going to die anyway. That there's something wrong here. That probably wasn't actually their names, but that's what they know. So they go, and Elimelech dies. And right away, if you're reading the book of Ruth, this happens in the first couple verses. He dies, and then the two sons die. And who's left? The mom named Naomi, and two daughters-in-law. One whose name is Orpah, and one whose name is Ruth. And Ruth and Orpah are there with Naomi, who's now broke, because she's not allowed to inherit anything. And so she has nothing, and she's older, and no one's going to marry her, and she has no way of making a living, and she says, I'm going home. I'm going to where I grew up. And the two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, they say, we'll come with you. And Naomi says, you don't want to come with me. It's going to be terrible. I have no money to support you. I have no family for you to marry. I can't give any more sons. There's nothing left for you. There's no reason to stay with me. If you come with me, your life will be as miserable in grinding poverty as mine is going to be. And at that point, Orpah says, you know, you make a good point. I'm out of here. She changed 2 letters in her name and started a TV show, and no one ever heard from her again. But Ruth says, your land will be my land, your God will be my God, and I will stick with you. I'll live in poverty with you. I'll take care of you. I'll do whatever I can from you. And we see, once you add the Midrash in, that Ruth becomes the antidote or the opposite of Elimelech. Elimelech, whose greed left him in this predicament, Ruth is now the antidote to say, there's a different way of looking at the world than what he did. Ruth is defined by what we call gemilut chasadim, a life of doing kindness for other people. Ruth was perfectly selfless. And so there are 2 highlights of the story, because you could easily read through this story and say, why do I need this story in the Bible at all? The first is that she says, your God will be my God, so everyone looks at that and says, she's the convert. She's the first convert, at least, to have a book written about her. Although Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, at least has a Torah portion named after him. But the very end of this very short book of the Tanakh tells us something more interesting. It says that Ruth eventually did get married to a man named Boaz, who takes her in and takes care of her and takes her, and her life works out actually very well after this. But she has a son named Oved. And Oved has a son named Jesse. And Jesse has a son named David. And Ruth becomes the par excellence example of what it means to be a Jewish leader. Because King David is her grandson. And King David is the prime Jewish leader who built Jerusalem and led the dynasty of the tribe of Judah and the Jewish people. There's a story I heard recently that one rabbi told about a contemporary rabbi in Jerusalem some 20 years ago. His name was Rab Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, very famous contemporary rabbi who lived in Jerusalem a couple of decades ago. Rabbi Auerbach was in Shaare Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem, which is, if you know Jerusalem, it's up towards the area where Yad Vashem and Mount Herzl are, on the way up there. And he was there because his wife was dying. His wife was very, very ill. And he was in her hospital room, and Shabbat was about to begin. And so he'd been in the hospital room all day, day in, day out, but before Shabbat, he wanted to go home and relax a little and just have some time to contemplate. His wife was already unconscious, and he'd been sitting with her for hours, and so he was about to go home. But he's a very famous rabbi in Jerusalem, and everyone was sort of gathered outside the hospital praying for his wife. So he went out a back way, through a back stairs, and he tried to sneak around and walk to his home. And as he was going into the stairwell, one of his students was coming up the stairs. And the student had no idea what was going on with Rabbi Auerbach. He was in his own world because his wife just had a baby. And so he said, Rabbi Auerbach, how are you? My wife just gave birth to a son. Rabbi Auerbach says, Mazel Tov. So the student says what you would say to your rabbi in such a situation, if you didn't know better, Rabbi, maybe you would consider coming to my wife's hospital room and giving a blessing to my new son. So Rabbi Auerbach responds, how do you know your wife is even up for a visitor? Wouldn't have thought of that. I mean, I might have. By the way, what we say here stays between us. My wife, this is just for us. So he goes into his wife's hospital room. Of course, Rabbi Auerbach, please, a blessing would be great. Rabbi Auerbach agrees to come in. He says a beautiful blessing. And he leaves, and he goes home. The next day, Shabbat ends. The day after that, his wife dies. And there are signs up all over in the traditional areas that this great woman has passed away. And immediately the father of the new boy sees a sign, and he realizes now why Rabbi Auerbach was in the hospital. And he goes to one of the nights of Shiva. And he comes to Rabbi Auerbach, and he's pouring his heart out. Rabbi, I'm so embarrassed. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that I drew you away in one of your most difficult hours. I can't believe that I brought you into my wife's room to give a blessing to my son while your wife is... He's going on and on and on. Rabbi Auerbach looks at him and says, what are you talking about? What does my wife's dying have anything to do with your son being born? What does my wife dying or my grief have to do with depriving your wife and your son of that blessing? This is a life, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, those who knew him knew that he lived a life of gemilut chasadim, of acts of kindness towards others. This is why the book of Ruth is connected to Shavuot. It's not just that she chose to be Jewish. A lot of people chose to be Jewish. It's that her style of leadership defines what a relationship with Torah is all about. A life of Torah is a life lived towards something greater than ourselves. Torah is the gift that teaches us how to do that. And that's why we connect the story of Ruth to Shavuot. That's why Ruth is the par excellence leader of the Jewish people and why her grandson had to be King David. That's why that story of Ruth has to be in the Tanakh, and that's why every year when we accept the Torah anew on the holiday of Shavuot, we should strive to emulate who Ruth was every time of the year. Ruth, there's Sukkot, there's Pesach. Ruth's who that other guy is. That's what Shavuot is supposed to be all about. Keni Hiratzon. May that be God's will. Amen.